Hey there, it's Kate Swoboda, also known as Kate Courageous. I'm the creator of YourCourageousLife.com, the director of the Courageous Living Coach certification at TeamCLCC.com, and I'm the author of the book The Courage Habit, which is available at booksellers everywhere and, of course, at Amazon. And as you might have guessed, I'm the host of this podcast, the Your Courageous Life podcast. We're going to talk about going after what you want and living a more courageous, emotionally resilient life. I might drop a couple of F-bombs, so don't listen with your kids in the back seat. And here we go. Hey. Today I'm talking to you about self-responsibility. And it goes by a lot of different names, I guess you could say. So there's like self-responsibility. Sometimes people say taking responsibility for your choices. Sometimes people say putting yourself in the driver's seat of your life. Sometimes people spiritualize it a bit and call it getting conscious. But for the most part, these all imply the same thing. They imply something that I think we fundamentally miss sometimes. It's something I know I missed in my own self-help journey. And it is that the ability, that you're equipped with the ability to actually do that. So these ideas about getting conscious or putting yourself in the driver's seat of your life or taking self-responsibility, they all imply that we're equipped with the ability to do that, to take responsibility for ourselves and our choices. And in this podcast episode, I'm going to talk about something that runs somewhat counter to the truisms of self-help. I think that actually self-responsibility is a skill. It's a skill. Think about that for a moment. It's not like this light switch that you flip, like you're either taking self-responsibility or you're not. It's a skill. And it's a skill that not everyone has. It's a skill that has different component parts. It's a skill that people need to learn, that's for sure, and work on. And it's one that takes time. Taking responsibility for your life is not as simple as sitting down with a pencil and a piece of paper and just working your noggin until you methodically arrive at some answer that is the right answer for taking responsibility. Learning the skill of taking responsibility for your life and your choices, let's make sure I get this really clear, definitely a helpful one. I'm just saying that many of us, maybe you, I know for me a long time, you may be currently assuming that you know how to do this without realizing that there's a part of you that doesn't, or that there's a gap that keeps you from being able to do this thing, this self-responsibility thing, as skillfully as you might like. And, like I said, if I'm completely candid, I'll share that this is exactly how I started my own personal work more than a decade ago. I'm a self-help dinosaur. That's what it is. Shout out to all my other self-help dinosaurs out there who are listening to this. That just means you've been doing self-help for a really long time. That's all. And you're not perfect yet, and that's okay. You're going to laugh with me? I hope so. So when I began doing my own personal work, if I'm honest, I, at the time, thought I was a rock star at understanding quote-unquote good and quote-unquote bad choices, and then choosing appropriately for the situation. And in truth, I tended to then, and can still tend now, to be something of an overanalyzer, trying to weigh all aspects of a situation so that I can fit into this nice little quote-unquote good choice versus bad choice paradigm. And this continues to some degree even as I get older and understand that, most choices don't fit squarely in one category or another. So maybe you can relate. Self-responsibility is enormously powerful. You want it. If you don't feel like you have that right now, or if it's not your strongest tool in the toolbox, you definitely want it. It's a tool that you can use to create a life where you have just about anything you want. It's the backbone of diligence and working hard in small bits of time to reach a desired goal, accountability, progress. That is rooted in self-responsibility. Self-responsibility promotes connection between people because self-responsibility is rooted in integrity, and integrity is rooted in trust. And people who take self-responsibility for their lives are trustworthy people. I know I trust someone who's willing to say, here's where I think I see my part in this situation. So if you want something in life, looking at self-responsibility is a great place to examine. Now, the limits of where someone, you, me, anyone else, can practice self-responsibility will show up usually in two places. Either because of larger systemic issues that prevents someone from truly having agency over their life, or in any place where we feel shame that we don't know how to process. Let me say that one more time. You can't really take self-responsibility, not 100%, if there is a larger systemic issue that prevents you from truly having agency over your life, over your choices, or in any place where you feel shame that you don't know how to process. Because if you're stuck in shame, you're not likely to be taking self-responsibility. And I'll break some of this down in this podcast episode. Because here's what happens with the shame piece. When we feel shame that we don't know how to process, the response is often to do whatever we can to bat the shame away or avoid it, to numb out. In effect, that becomes stepping away from self-responsibility through that avoidance or through that defensiveness. And I love learning something when it comes with an example. And would you believe I have examples to offer? Here we go. So I was great with, in my own life, taking self-responsibility around work or getting exercise or paying bills. And I didn't feel shame in those areas. So it felt natural, or maybe not natural, but it just felt okay to say to myself, yeah, I haven't been prioritizing sitting down to pay bills, and that's why this one was late. So I got to take responsibility for that. I got to pay the late fee. But asking me to take self-responsibility for any area where I unconsciously or sometimes consciously felt shame, oh, forget it. Like, if I got a pot shot in during an argument with my husband, I didn't want to take self-responsibility and account for my behavior with an apology. Because I felt shame about how I was treating another human being, I just wanted to defend. So I go to this place of like, something has to be his fault, I have to be right, he has to be wrong. I can think of a time when someone confronted me about a racist microaggression that I made. And I didn't want to take self-responsibility. I'm going to explain away my behavior. It wasn't that serious, or I'm going to play it like this other person, they didn't really understand what I was saying. And why? Because I felt shame about, one, my own complicity in racism through committing a microaggression, and because I felt shame about what it means to have white skin in a racist culture. And I hadn't dealt with any of that shame, and I was in hiding around it because I hadn't dealt with it. And those of you who are Dr. Brene Brown fans probably already know, working with, confronting, acknowledging shame, ongoing process. It gets easier the more you do it, but when you aren't doing it all, it's really, really hard. So let's say that you recognize that there's immense power in taking responsibility for your life, but you imagine there's some places where you probably avoid doing that because you're human, just like me, just like everybody, and you want to stop avoiding. To see things clearly, look at where you feel shame. If you want to see where you might not be taking self-responsibility, look at where shame rises up, because the shame rises up around things that we feel bad about, and it's really hard to take self-responsibility around things that we feel bad about. And if the shame feels hard to identify, just start paying attention in your life at the places that you defend, the places you push away, the places you want to avoid. And by the way, a little compassion here. Do you see how layered this is? Like how complex it actually is to quote unquote take responsibility for your life when there's this entire area where people set up complex defenses. Fact, when we are wounded, we try not to see because we're hoping that in not seeing, not looking at it, not touching it, not examining it, not feeling it, we won't experience further wounding. Now, I'll try offering another example to explain this concept. I had someone in my life who was routinely speaking to me in ways that were really disrespectful and behaving in ways that were passive aggressive, a little bit of back channeling thrown in where they'd go to other people to talk about me behind my back. And first, here's how I responded. First, this hurt. I just have to take a little aside and say, I don't know who these people are in the world who claim not to care what anyone says about them. I find that stance, I don't give a fuck what anybody says about me. I find that to be divorced from normal human emotion. I just don't get it. I'm not saying it has to control me when someone doesn't like me. I'm just saying that there's an initial, very human response where it hurts. When someone is unkind to me, it hurts. It hurts my heart. There's like this little kid within me who just doesn't understand why in any conflict in my life, we can't all just sit down and talk things through and apologize for our parts and work it all out. Second truth, though, this pissed me off, this behavior from this other person. The person in question was or is an adult, and I would think to myself in these angry moments like, you graduated from kindergarten, so it's reasonable to assume that you know not to be mean to people. I wanted this person to take responsibility for her actions, to apologize, to try to work through them with me. There were things being done or said that were hands down mean. And in an effort to take self-responsibility myself, I'd even approach this person and I would really think about, okay, is there, like sometimes the bridge to connection is built by someone taking the first step. Let me be the person to take the first step. And I'd think of anything I could think of that was my part, and I'd bring that to her, and I'd apologize for anything I could think of taking responsibility for. And then I'd seethe when she responded to my apology with something like, well, thank you. That about sums up what happened, without offering any apology for her part in what had happened between us. I mean, I really tried to figure this one out. Why was this person acting this way? If I was pissy and angry with her, I got the same thing. If I was sweet and bubbly and chipper and pretended not to notice a single thing that she did, and I'm just going to be love, I'm going to be light, I got the same thing. If I was distant and resentful, I got the same thing. If I called her out, I got the same thing. If I had actual evidence of something she did that she swore she had not done, I got the same thing. No taking responsibility for her behavior, no apologies, no let's work it out, nothing. And then finally, I understood. And I mean, I really got down into it and understood. People avoid taking responsibility for their lives or choices in areas where they feel shame. So to actually take responsibility and apologize for this person would mean she'd need to dive into all of that shame and unpack it and ask herself why she did what she did or said what she said. She knew that the impact of her behavior had been hurt. I had made that clear. She wasn't taking responsibility because she wasn't seeing that she was responsible for any part of it. And to do that, to see that, would require unpacking the shame. Now I lay all of this out, and don't worry if you've been wondering why I got my britches up in somebody else's business. I'm about to get to that in just a second. Because how did I finally really come to understand all of this? I understood it when I looked at my own patterns and asked myself how the two of us were alike. Like earlier, I gave examples of deflecting and defending around issues where I felt shame. I didn't want to take responsibility. Arguments with my husband, my position of privilege in our society. In both of those situations, I felt shame, and that shame caused me to deflect and defend and not take a responsibility. And in that way, I could see I was just like her, just like anybody else. Taking self-responsibility is a skill. Like any skill, learning to drive, speak a new language, follow a recipe, it has a few component parts. So let me break down some of these component parts and see for yourself where pieces feel stronger for you and which ones might need some attention. All right, here we go. So first, self-responsibility requires agency. And agency means power, capacity. If I don't have agency over my own life, over my rights, over my ability to affect change without barriers, then I am limited in how much responsibility I can take for any situation in my life. And I think that's important to say because often there's a kind of spiritual bypass that happens in self-help where people are so quick to rush to how you can take charge of your own life and, make better choices and all that, but they don't necessarily always take that beat. And I am trying increasingly to be more conscious of taking that beat to pause and to remind people that self-flagellation over circumstances they can't control is not a kind thing to do to oneself. And for any of us who do any of this self-help work, we should be reminding people who have had access to their rights denied and things of that nature, we should be reminding them that it's not just about, oh, your mindset. So self-responsibility requires agency. I can only take self-responsibility for my attitudes, my intentions, my responses in any scenario, and especially when I don't actually have power over my own life, or my own rights. Sometimes with the various oppressions and isms of society, even for people who otherwise have a lot of choices, that's the best they can do is I'm going to take responsibility for my attitude, my intentions, my responses. I think, just to give an example, if I, as a woman, am being passed over for a promotion because of my gender, I can take responsibility for my attitude about that, my intentions, my responses, but I should not be asked by other people to participate in a catch-all kind of, you create your life, your vibration is what attracted it, you need to take responsibility for that. No, Self-responsibility can't fully happen 100% without someone also having agency. Another piece, self-responsibility requires examples or a framework or some model or vision for where you're trying to go. I mean, think about this. Like, would you ever start trying to learn how to drive without having any idea what a car looks like? Or any idea what a stop sign looks like? Like, you have to have some framework. And it took me years to take responsibility for my choices, in part because I didn't know what the hell that looked like. Like, I really, truly did not feel I knew. I just felt like, what does it mean to be responsible for your life? How do you square that up with times when you're hurting and it feels really real that everything outside of you is at fault? And initially, from the outside looking in, I couldn't say that I really understood when I looked at other people whether or not someone was consciously creating their life or taking self-responsibility for their life. Finally, I did start to notice something that all the people who took self-responsibility did in some way, shape, or form before they looked at what anyone else did or what any other piece was. They looked at themselves and they checked in. So it wasn't that they neglected to call a thing and say what needed to change beyond their own two eyeballs. Like, if there was some shenanigans going on in terms of being deprived of your rights or being discriminated against, it's not that people who take self-responsibility pretend not to see that. But the place where they start is a check-in within themselves, a kind of, wait, hold on, this is not right, and I know this is not right. Before I react, let me decide how I want to react. Let me decide how I want to respond. Self-responsibility requires room for nuance. This is a big one. This can untangle a lot for people around self-blame. Most people are not raised by parents who model the nuances of taking responsibility for your life while also processing in a healthy way normal human emotion. Think about how you were raised for a moment. Most of us are conditioned around a binary good-bad model of just about everything, which means that we do that with self-responsibility too. Think about how you grew up. If you made a mistake, was there nuance or was there good-bad? Products, characters on television, a host of storylines in the media portray one side is good, the other is bad, there is no in between. And this plays itself out in one-sided views of what it looks like to enact justice. Someone does something wrong, therefore they are bad, therefore they go to jail, end of story. That's a binary right-wrong model. Someone who does something wrong should apologize. They're wrong and therefore bad, and the only way to redeem themselves is through apology, and they should be contrite about that apology. That too is more of the binary right-wrong model. I was raised with it. Just about everyone I know was raised with it. It's everywhere. And in fact, real life and self-responsibility require nuance. I can be willing to take responsibility for my life by offering someone an apology for my part, while also at the same time struggling with feeling resentment about their part. It's not all one is good and all one is bad. Like, it's just more complicated than that. It's not one or the other. So self-responsibility requires room for nuance, where you don't put yourself into that good-bad binary. And on that note, self-responsibility requires self-compassion and forgiveness. You know, some people, especially at first, guilty as charged over here, jump into the self-responsibility bandwagon with this rigid right-wrong attitude about responsibility that largely adds up to trying to be perfect. Like, I'm perfect if I always take responsibility, and I'm angry at myself until I fully take responsibility in every possible way. And the truth is that even if you're being as conscious as you know how to be and taking responsibility for your intentions and responses and attitudes, you're still going to quote unquote mess up. You're going to have places where you don't choose well. And it's a ton of work to have enough humility to own up to that. And that's great if you have that humility, and that's part of taking self-responsibility. But there's this other piece that has to go with that. It's perhaps even greater work to offer yourself true self-compassion and forgiveness. Self-responsibility requires practice to go from a life where you're largely just coasting along to a life where you're putting intentionality behind your choices, really thinking them through, deeply feeling into them before you respond. That's going to require practice. Give yourself that room. This is another big one. Self-responsibility requires the ability to self-assess. That might seem really strange, but there are people who really don't always know, like, am I on track? Am I off track with what my values are? With, and that can involve some somatic work sometimes. Somatic work is all about getting familiar with when I feel this particular thing in my body, what does it mean? Knowing when something is going well and is aligned with your values may be unfamiliar or uncomfortable territory for you. How do you know that you're living in alignment with your values when you've never done it before, right? And similarly, being able to recognize signs that you are off track can be part of self-responsibility. It's those little warning signs in your intuition or the value metrics that you establish That will tell you whether or not there's a place where you're avoiding taking responsibility in your life. And last, self-responsibility requires the ability to respond effectively to what you understand to be going on. So first, there's self-assessment. What's actually going on here? Do I feel good about this or don't I? And then the ability to respond effectively to what you understand to be going on is the next piece. Some people might have the skill of recognizing that something's off and something doesn't feel right. So they have some of that self-assessment ability, but they don't know what to do next. And maybe that's the moment when they go into an old pattern of avoidance or letting fate decide what happens next instead of taking a really proactive step towards what they want. So speaking of all that, I wanted to bring this back to a real example, this situation where I was feeling pretty crappy when I was interacting with someone. Self-responsibility requires the ability to respond effectively to what's going on. I said that already, and I mean it. I was not responding effectively in this situation with this person who was doing things that for me didn't feel good. And part of the reason I was not responding effectively is because I was getting really caught up in monitoring what someone else was doing in a conflict, taking their inventory, which is an AA recovery saying where you're basically judging somebody else's life, wanting them to do something different, resenting that they weren't doing anything different. Those behaviors were not making me happy. And I was the one squarely in charge of that monitoring and that judgment. This is the part I was talking about when I said I'll get back to being all up in somebody else's business. This is it. I was making their behavior my business. I couldn't change what they were up to. All I could do was shift my own part to either not engage with them or to engage differently. And that was the humbling moment where I realized I needed to take self-responsibility for that. And if I'm honest, at first that option felt a little bit like the loser's prize. Like, hey, they just get to keep being a jerk and I get to, take responsibility for my response. Yay me, can't wait. But as I turned it over, I gotta tell you, this came to me. To take self-responsibility in this way was the key to my emotional freedom, because I felt really controlled by what they were doing, because all my attention was going on to what they were doing instead of taking self-responsibility and looking at what I was doing. To take responsibility for me and how I was responding, that was the key to my emotional freedom. And I gotta tell you, emotional freedom, that feels pretty damn good. All right, I hope this was helpful for you. As always, so appreciated if you take a moment to review the Your Courageous Life podcast. It helps more people to find what I'm up to. Hope today's podcast gave you a lot of food for thought. I will hang out with you over on, I'm on Instagram a lot these days. That's probably the best place to find me. Instagram.com/Kate Courageous. And you can, of course, get all kinds of free courageous goodies over at yourcourageouslife.com/begin. Have a great rest of your day, and here's to taking self-responsibility.